السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته طلاب المرحلة الثانية كلية الصيدلة جامعة بابل. Our topic today is female reproductive hormones. The female gonads are the ovaries which, together with the uterus and fallopian tubes, constitute the female reproductive tract. The ovaries have two functions. First is the oogenesis, and second is the secretion of female sex steroid hormones, including progesterone and estrogen. Each adult ovary is attached to the uterus by ligaments, and running through these ligaments are the ovarian arteries, veins, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. The anatomy of female reproductive system, including the uterus, ovaries, fallopian tubes. The ovary has three zones. First, which is the cortex, is the outer and the largest zone. It is lined by germinal epithelium and contains all the oocytes, each of which is enclosed in a follicle. The oocytes are enclosed in a follicle. The ovarian follicles are also responsible for steroid hormone synthesis. The second zone is the medulla, which is the middle zone and is a mixture of cell types, while the third zone is the hilum, which is the inner zone through which blood vessels and lymphatic pass. The ovarian steroid hormones have both paracrine and endocrine functions, and as you remember, what is the paracrine function and the endocrine function? Locally, within the ovaries, the ovarian steroid hormones act to support the development of ova, and systemically, the ovarian steroid hormone acts on a variety of target tissue, including uterus, breast, and bones. The functional unit of the ovary is single ovarian follicle, which comprise one germ cell surrounded by endocrine cells. When fully developed, the ovarian follicle, when fully developed, the ovarian follicle serves several critical roles. It will provide nutrient for the developing oocytes. It will release the oocytes at the proper time, which is the time of ovulation. It will prepare the vagina and fallopian tubes to aid in fertilization of the egg by the sperms. Also, it will prepare the lining of the uterus for implantation of the fertilized egg. During the event of fertilization, it will maintain steroid hormone production for the fetus until the placenta can assume this role. How oogenesis occurs? In the developing ovaries, a primordial germ cells produce oogonia by mitotic division until the 20 to 24 weeks of embryonic life. The primordial germ cell are produce the oogonia during the embryonic life. At that time, there are approximately 7 million oogonia present in the ovaries. At 8 to 9 weeks of gestational period, some of these oogonia enter the prophase of meiosis and become primary oocytes. They will develop from primordial germ cells into primary oocytes. The mitotic process continues until approximately 6 months after birth, at which point all oogonia have become oocytes. These oocytes remain in a state of suspended prophase, which is the first mitotic division, will not be completed until ovulation occurs many years later. At this stage, about 6 months after birth, the oocytes remain at the state of suspended prophase, when the first mitotic division will not become completed until the ovulation that occur many years later. I mean, when she reach the puberty. At birth, only 2 million oocytes remains. As you remember, we start with 7 million oogonia. When we reach to birth, only 2 million oocytes remains. By puberty, only 400,000 oocytes remain, and by menopause, few, if any, oocytes remain. Females do not produce new oogonia and function from declining pool of oocytes. What are the stages of development of ovarian follicle? Ovarian follicle development occur in the following stages. The first stage is the prophase of oocyte. Thus, the first stage of ovarian follicle lasts many years, as we discussed in the last slide. The shortest duration for the first stage is approximately 13 years. As the primary oocyte goes, the granulosa cell proliferation occur. These granulosa cells will proliferate to provide oocyte with the nutrients and steroid hormones. During this stage, the primordial follicle develops into a primary follicle. As you see, this is the primordial follicle, and this is the primary, and this is the primary oocyte. During this stage, the primordial follicle, as we said, develops into primary follicle, and theca interna cell will develop. These are the theca interna cells. And the granulosa cells begin to secrete fluids. These are the granulosa cells. As you see, how there's change in the size of these cells from the primordial follicle to the primary follicle. The most important for survival of the primary follicle is the theca interna cells and the granulosa cells. No follicle progress beyond this first stage in the pre-pubertal ovaries. When the female is still in the childhood period, no follicle progress beyond the first stage. Now, the second stage. This stage takes place over a period of 70 to 85 days and is present only during the reproductive period. During each menstrual cycle, a few follicles enter this stage, which is called the second stage. A fluid containing steroid hormone, mucopolysaccharides and protein and FSH accumulate in the central area of the follicle, which is called the antrum. This is the antrum that contains the nutrients and the steroid hormones. The steroid hormones reach the antrum by direct secretion from granulosa cells, which are these lines of cells. These granulosa cells will be responsible for the production of steroid hormones. The granulosa and the theca cells continue to grow. At the end of the second stage, the follicle is called the Gravian follicle and has average diameter of 2 to 5 millimeter. This is the structure of Gravian follicle, which occur at the end of the second stage. The third stage, which is the final stage of follicular development, is the most rapid, occur within 5 to 7 days after menses. A single Gravian follicle achieves dominance over the cohorts of other Gravian follicles. The other follicles will regress, and within 48 hours, the dominant follicle will grow to 20 millimeter in diameter. On day 14 of the menstrual cycle, which is called the day of ovulation, ovulation will occur, and the dominant follicle will rupture and release its oocytes into the peritoneal cavity. At this time, the first mitotic division is completed and the resulting secondary oocyte enters the nearby fallopian tube, where it begins the second mitotic division. You have to remember that the second mitotic division will occur when the secondary oocyte enters to the nearby fallopian tube. In the fallopian tube, if fertilization by the sperms occur, the second mitotic division is completed. What happened to the residual of Gravian follicle that remain in the ovary? The residual elements of the ruptured primary follicle form what is called corpus luteum. If you see this figure, this is the growing follicles and this is the mature Gravian follicle, and one of these Gravian follicle will be dominate and reach to the surface of the ovary. After that, rupture of the Gravian follicle will release the secondary oocyte, which will pass into fallopian tube. The remaining part of the ruptured Gravian follicle will form what is called the corpus luteum, which is composed primarily of granulosa cells, but also it contains the theca cells, capillaries, and fibroblasts. The corpus luteum synthesizes and secretes steroid hormones, which are necessary for implantation and maintenance of the zygote. If fertilization occurs, corpus luteum will secrete steroid hormone until the placenta assume this role later during pregnancy. But if fertilization does not occur, corpus luteum will regress during the next 14 days, which is the second half of menstrual cycle, and is replaced by what is called corpus albicans, which is a scar tissue. Another figure demonstrates the ovaries and the stages of oogenesis. In the ovaries, all steps in the biosynthetic pathway are present, including aromatase, which convert testosterone to 17-beta estradiol, which is the major ovarian estrogen. This is how the ovary can biosynthesize estrogen, by the presence of aromatase enzyme. Also, progesterone and 17-beta estradiol are synthesized as follows. Theca cells synthesize and secrete progesterone. Also, theca cells synthesize androstenedione. This androstenedione diffuse from the theca cells to the nearby granulosa cells, which contain the 17-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase and aromatase enzymes. In the granulosa cells, the androstenedione is converted to testosterone, and testosterone is then converted to 17-beta estradiol. FSH and LH each have a role in the biosynthetic process. How? The luteinizing hormone stimulates cholesterol dismolase in the theca cells, which is the first step in the biosynthetic pathway, while follicle stimulating hormone stimulates aromatase in the granulosa cells, the last step in the synthesis of 17-beta estradiol. What is the role of hypothalamic pituitary axis in the regulation of ovarian hormones? Both functions of the ovaries, including the oogenesis and the steroid hormone secretion, are controlled by hypothalamic pituitary axis. The hypothalamic hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, and the anterior pituitary hormones, which are FSH and LH. Ovarian functions in the female is driven by pulsatile activity of hypothalamic pituitary axis. The gonadotropic releasing hormone is delivered directly to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland in a high concentration, where it stimulates a pulsatile secretion of both FSH and LH. Then FSH and LH act on the ovaries to stimulate follicular development and ovulation, and also to stimulate the synthesis of female sex steroids hormone. As you see, the pulsatile production of gonadotropic releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary gland will stimulate production of FSH and LH. As you see, the LH hormone will stimulate theca cell to control the conversion of cholesterol into androstenedione in the presence of this molase enzyme, while the FSH act on the granulosa cells of the ovary. Both these cells are present in the ovaries. The FSH will act on the granulosa cells to stimulate conversion of androstenedione, which is produced in the theca cells and transferred to the granulosa cells. It will convert it into estrogen under the effect of aromatase enzyme. So there will be production of estrogen. To understand the hypothalamic pituitary control of the ovaries, it is necessary to appreciate its cyclic behavior. Every 28 days, a sequences of follicular development, ovulation, and formation, degeneration of the corpus luteum is repeated in the what is called menstrual cycle. The first 14 days of menstrual cycle involve development of the follicle. This is called the follicular phase, the first 14 days of menstrual cycle. The last 14 days of menstrual cycle are dominated by the corpus luteum, and that is why they are called the luteal phase. At the midpoint of the cycle, between the follicular phase and the luteal phase, ovulation will occur at the 14 days of the cycle. The action of FSH and LH on the follicular development and on ovulation can be explained as follows. This is a figure that demonstrates the menstrual cycle. This is the follicular phase when the follicle is dominant. This is the ovulation, which occurs at the mid of the cycle at day 14, and this is the luteal phase where the corpus luteum is dominant. FSH, if we want to understand its action, the granulosa cells are the only ovarian cells which contain FSH receptors. The only ovarian cells that contain receptors for FSH is the granulosa cells. What happened if the FSH attached to its receptors on a granulosa cell? It will stimulate the growth of granulosa cells in primary follicles, and it will stimulate the estradiol synthesis, as we saw in the last figure. The locally produced estradiol then support the trophic effect of FSH on the follicular cells, while LH will help the ovulation. How? Ovulation is initiated by the effect of luteinizing hormone. Just prior to the ovulation, I mean at day 14, the concentration of LH in the blood will rise sharply, and it will induce rupture of the dominant Gravian follicle, releasing the oocyte. Also, luteinizing hormone stimulates formation of the corpus luteum, a process called luteinization, and maintains the steroid hormone production by the corpus luteum during the luteal phase of menstrual cycle. As you see, this is the day of ovulation. These are the hormones, which are the FSH, the LH, okay, and this is the LH surge, a sharp rise in LH concentration in the blood occur at the time of ovulation. And this is the luteal phase, and you see how the LH hormone is remaining high. Another figure which demonstrates the ovarian cycle. And how the ovulation is stimulated by a sharp rise in luteinizing hormone secretion during the time of ovulation. Another figure. This is the follicular phase. This is the FSH and the LH, and this is the sharp rise in LH release during the time of ovulation. These are estrogen and progesterone, and you can see the ovarian hormone level, how the estrogen level increases during the time of ovulation, while during the luteal phase the progesterone secretion will be increased. This figure can demonstrate simply what the events that occurs during the ovarian cycle and during the uterine cycle. These are the ovarian cycle and uterine cycle under the name of menstrual cycle. As you see, a low estrogen at the end of the mens will give stimulation to production of FSH hormone when the follicular phase occur at the first 14 days of the menstrual cycle. This will help in progress of the oogenesis and the production of Gravian follicle that will become dominant under the effect of estrogen, which help to maintain the right environment for development of follicles. Then during ovulation under the effect of LH, luteinizing hormone, the release of ova occur at the 14th day of menstrual cycle. The remaining of the follicle will form what is called corpus luteum. At this time, there will be an increase in the level of progesterone hormone. Then the corpus luteum will help to maintain steroid hormone production at the luteal phase. If no pregnancy occurs, then the corpus luteum will be converted into the corpus albicans, and finally menses will develop. If we take the topic from the uterine cycle, there will be during proliferative phase, which occurs during the follicular phase, influenced by estrogen and thickness of the endometrium rapidly increase. Then after ovulation, secretory phase will develop, influenced by effect of progesterone, and the lining of the uterus will become highly vascular and edematous, which is a preparation for implantation of the new zygote. If no pregnancy occurs, then mens will develop. What is the negative and positive feedback mechanism that control the production of sex hormones in the females? In females, the hypothalamic pituitary axis is controlled by negative and positive feedback depending on the menstrual cycle phases. In the follicular phase, the menstrual cycle, FSH and LH stimulate synthesis and secretion of estradiol by the follicular cells. One of the action of estradiol, which is produced by the follicular cells, is a negative feedback on the anterior pituitary to inhibit further secretion of FSH and LH. Thus, the follicular phase is dominant by negative feedback effect of estradiol. At mid-cycle, the pattern change. Estradiol level will rise sharply as a result of proliferation of follicular cells and the stimulation of estradiol synthesis that occurred during the follicular phase. When a critical level of estradiol is reached, estradiol has a positive feedback effect on the anterior pituitary by upregulating the gonadotrophic releasing hormone receptors in the anterior pituitary, thus causing further secretion of FSH and LH. This occurs during the mid-cycle period. This burst of hormone secretion by the anterior pituitary is called the ovulatory surge. This is how LH secretion or LH concentration in the blood will be very high at time of ovulation, which is called the ovulatory surge of FSH and LH. Then triggers ovulation of the mature oocytes. This is the follicular phase, the mid-cycle, and the luteal phase. And as you see in the follicular phase, a production of estradiol will have a negative feedback on the anterior pituitary, while in the mid-cycle, the production of estradiol will reach very high concentration and will have a positive feedback effect on the anterior pituitary to produce more and more FSH and LH and produce ovulatory surge of FSH and LH during the mid-cycle. While in the luteal phase, which is the phase that predominantly affected by progesterone will have a negative feedback mechanism on the anterior pituitary to decrease production of FSH and LH. In the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, the major hormonal secretion of the ovaries are the progesterone. One of the action of progesterone is the negative feedback on the anterior pituitary to inhibit secretion of FSH and LH. The luteal phase is dominant by negative feedback effect of progesterone, as we saw in the last figure. Another factors that affect the ovarian hormones are inhibin and activin. Inhibin is produced by the ovarian granulosa cells. As in the testes, it inhibits FSH secretion from the anterior pituitary, while activin is also produced by the ovarian granulosa cells and it stimulates the FSH secretion. Another figure. Action of estrogen. I will leave it for you to see what are the actions of estrogen on our bodies and action of progesterone. These are figures demonstrate the synthesis of estrogen and progesterone. Another figures hormonal regulation of menstrual cycle. To make the subject easier for you. What is the action of estrogen and progesterone? In general, the two ovarian steroid hormones function in coordination fashion to support reproductive activity of female, including development of the ova, development and maintenance of the corpus luteum to sustain fertilized ovum, maintenance of a pregnancy, and the preparation of a breast for lactation. Usually, estrogen and progesterone complement or enhance each other actions in the female reproductive tract. Occasionally, they antagonize or modulate each other's actions. Over the course of menstrual cycle, estrogen secretion by the ovaries precedes progesterone secretion. Why? Preparing the target tissue to respond to progesterone. What does this mean? We will see in the example. Example for this preparation is seen in the upregulation of progesterone receptors by estrogen in several target tissue. Without estrogen and its upregulating action, progesterone has little biological activity. Conversely, progesterone will downregulate estrogen receptors in some target tissue, decreasing their responsiveness to estrogen. What happens during menstrual cycle? Menstrual cycle usually will recur approximately every 28 days over the reproductive period of the female, from the puberty until menopause. The events of the cycle include development of an ovarian follicle and its oocyte ovulation preparation of the reproductive tract to receive the fertilized ova. And finally, shedding of the endometrial lining if fertilization does not occur. The cycle length can vary from 21 to 35 days, but the average length is 28 days. The variability in the length is attributable to variability in the duration of follicular phase. The luteal phase is constant. Why? Because it starts from the time of ovulation until the menstrual period. The hormonal changes and events of the 28 days menstrual cycle are described in the following steps. First, the follicular or proliferative phase occurs from day 0 until day 14. During this period, the primordial follicle develops into Gravian follicle, and neighboring follicles become atractic, degenerated, and the remaining follicle is called the dominant follicle. Early in the follicular phase, receptors for FSH and LH are upregulated in the ovarian theca and granulosa cells. As you remember, we said this in the last slides. And the gonadotropin stimulate the synthesis of estradiol. The follicular phase is dominant by the 17 beta estradiol, whose level steadily increases. The high levels of estradiol cause proliferation of endometrial lining. High level of estradiol will cause proliferation of the endometrial lining of the uterus and inhibits FSH and LH secretion by the anterior pituitary. By what? By a negative feedback mechanism. Then, ovulation will occur at day 14 of the menstrual cycle and will be followed by a burst of estradiol secretion at the end of the follicular phase. The burst of estradiol, as you remember, will have a positive feedback effect on FSH and LH secretion by the anterior pituitary, called the FSH and LH surge. The FSH and LH surge then cause ovulation of the mature ovum. Estradiol level now will be decreased just after ovulation, but they will increase again during the luteal phase. The last phase is the luteal or secretory phase. Occur from the day 14 to day 28, ending with the onset of menses. During the luteal phase, the corpus luteum develop and begin synthesize estradiol and progesterone. This high level of progesterone during the luteal phase will stimulate secretory activity of endometrium and increase its vascularity. Thus, in the follicular phase, estradiol cause the endometrial lining to proliferate. In the luteal phase, progesterone is preparing the endometrium to receive fertilized ovum. Basal body temperature increases during the luteal phase because progesterone increases the hypothalamic temperature set point. The cervical mucus becomes less abundant and thicker, and it is now too late for sperm to fertilize the ova during the luteal phase. Late in the luteal phase, if fertilization has not occurred, the corpus luteum regresses. With this regression, the luteal source of estradiol and progesterone is lost, and the blood level of hormones decrease abruptly. Finally, mens will develop. After regression of corpus luteum and the abrupt loss of estradiol and progesterone, the endometrial lining and the blood will slough, so menstrual bleeding will start. Typically, mens lasts 4 to 5 days, corresponding to day 0 to 4 or 5 of the next menstrual cycle. During this time, primordial follicle for the next cycle are being recruited and they are beginning to develop. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will see you in the next lecture. See you then.